welcome to Akers Chapter 6 on social bonding and control theories. So this chapter is actually going to talk about two different categories of theory. There we go. Okay. So a couple things to think about when we're talking about control theories. Control theories are assuming that there are plenty of reasons for people to break the law. And instead of asking why do people break the law, they're asking why do people conform. And what they're essentially looking at are social controls. When those controls weaken or break down, we would then find ourselves free to deviate. Hirschi and Gottfriedson refer to non-control theories as positivistic, theories that have nothing to do with what prevents crimes. Instead, they focus on factors that positively motivate people to commit crimes. The authors of this text, Akers and Sellers, disagree with this distinction. Sure, control theory focuses more on what curbs crime, and explaining what causes us to not deviate or what causes us to deviate are essentially two sides of the same coin. So if I can explain why you conform your behavior to the law, then I'm also explaining why you don't conform your behavior to the law. To account for one can account for the other. So let's look at early control theories. So we have Reiss and Nye's theories of internal and external control. And they're talking about two types of control. One is self-control, and this is a socialization process, or rather socialization is how we acquire self-control. If you think about small children, they don't have a lot of self-control, right? They see something in a store, they want it, you tell them no, they cry, they pitch a fit. Presumably when you get told no today, you don't cry and pitch a fit in public. We control a person's behavior through external applications of social sanctions, right? So what kind of punishments happen to us? Those could be both formal and informal. And rewards for conformity and punishments for deviance. So one of the ways that we socialize people is through these sanctions. And again, this could be, at a more formal level, like the criminal justice system, but it also happens in school, it happens in your home. Reiss attributed the cause of delinquency to the failure of personal and social controls. Personal controls are those internalized controls we have, our ability to control our behavior, where social controls operate through both formal and informal sanctions. So remember, formal sanctions are those handed down by the criminal justice system. Informal sanctions are those handed down by parents, friends, employers, school. Nye expanded on this and identified two main categories of control that prevent delinquency. Direct control is punishment for misbehavior and rewards for compliance. Indirect is when we refrain from bad behavior because our behavior might cause pain and disappointment for others. Internal control is our conscience or our sense of guilt that prevents us from behaving badly. And Nye really emphasized these informal, indirect controls within the family. The more our needs as teenagers are met within the family, the less likely we are to turn to others to meet them and to turn to unacceptable methods of meeting those needs. Reiss has what's called containment theory. He talks about inner and outer containment, and these are basically internal control and external control. And then he also talks about factors that motivate juveniles to commit delinquent acts. And he talks about things that push them towards delinquency or pull them towards delinquency. So these pushes and pulls towards delinquency need to be countered by this internal and external control. Outer containment is parental and school supervision, consistent moral front, whereas inner containment is a good self-concept and a strong conscience. The only part of this theory that's really been tested very well is good self-concept. And what some research has found is that boys with good self-concepts at age 12 were less likely to be arrested or delinquent at age 16. This is a theory you should be a little bit more familiar with, Sykes and Matza. They talk about techniques of neutralization neutralization, and they also talk about drift. So essentially what these guys are talking about is that most teenagers are not committed to a delinquent lifestyle. When teenagers engage in delinquency, they tend to drift in and out of this behavior. So when they do drift into delinquent behavior, how do they justify that behavior? And they use what they have called techniques of neutralization. And Sykes and Matza have 5. If you do some other readings, you might find a couple of other ones. This interpretation of techniques of neutralization is not consistent with how Hirschi viewed them when he originally stated social bond theory. He recognizes it as Sykes and Matza's attempt to specify what we mean by definitions favorable to crime, whereas Hirschi incorporates techniques of neutralization as indicators of belief. Costello viewed the techniques of neutralization as different from control theory. Costello found delinquents who endorsed police-related neutralization score higher on measures of self-esteem. Delinquents who use general neutralizing techniques do not have higher self-esteem. And he also pointed out links between our cognitive processes and techniques of neutralization. Topali demonstrated that neutralization can mitigate our guilt. So basically, it's ways of sort of alleviating the bad feelings we feel when we break the rules. Now, Hirschi develops several theories, and Hirschi also collaborates with Gottfredson. And Hirschi's theory here that we're going to talk about is social bond theory. So previous versions of control theory then were superseded by this version that Hirschi comes up with. And he has a full statement of the theory, and it's published in Causes of Delinquency. It is considered to be internally consistent, coherent, parsimonious, and can be applied to any type of crime or deviant behavior. So basically what he did is he looked at all the prior formulations of control theory, tried to bring them together. So Hirschi talks about social bonds and talks about how we're all bonded to society. And that bond consists of 4 elements. And you know what? I'm not going to talk about this in too much depth because I just looked ahead, and this is Becca's Pechakucha. So I'm going to skip over a little bit of this so that Becca doesn't have to give us the same lecture twice. But please review these slides on your own. We'll talk a little bit about how some of these concepts have been measured. So Hirschi does talk about clear measures that we can use. And he talks about, when he talks about attachments to parents, to school, to peers, he does provide some specific ways we can measure this. This is a thing that is really necessary when we're testing a formula. When we're looking at concepts, we really want to make sure we're testing them appropriately. So for attachment to parents, they're talking about supervision and discipline, good communication. Sometimes they'll ask kids questions about would they like to be similar to their parents or the same kind of person as their parents. Academic achievement in school can be used to indicate commitment, involvement, and belief. Attachment to school can refer to positive attitudes towards school, kids who are concerned about what their teachers think about them, whether or not they accept the authority of the school. And attachment to peers, we can look at this in terms of how we respect the opinions of our friends and how much we identify with them. For commitment to conventional lines of activity, here we can talk about premature engagement in smoking, drinking, how much someone is pursuing conventional goals. We can look at someone's educational aspirations. And in terms of involvement, we can ask them about time spent with family, friends, time spent doing homework, sports, recreational activities. For beliefs, we can look at references to values relative to law and conventional values. The extent to which a teen has a general respect for law enforcement and the law. Do they believe the law should be obeyed? How important is education? So we can construct some pretty specific questions here that would measure each of these concepts. So if we look at this, what can we find? Well, Hirschi did some research on his own theory, and he found support for it. And he did find that with the exception of involvement, and involvement and commitment are a little bit similar, the weaker the bonds, the higher the likelihood of delinquency. Delinquency is strongly associated with delinquent friends. This, however, is a little bit more along the lines of social learning theory. Parental discipline, childbearing practices are good predictors of delinquency as well. Cronin Massey found the elements to be moderately related to minor delinquency. Agnew did some research on this and found attachment was not related, and commitment was weakly related to minor delinquency. Lasley looked at some forms of adult crime, in particular white-collar crime, and found that they were related to social bonds, while Akers and Cochran found the variables to be moderately related to teen marijuana use. Attachment to parents in an intact home is one of the best protective factors. So a protective factor would be something that would protect you from engaging in delinquency. Hirschi did not include religious beliefs, but obviously religious beliefs would represent conventional values. Bayer and Reiss, in a meta-analysis of studies that looked at religion, found religion to be protective against delinquent behavior. Some other research has really talked about, though, how this is most important when it comes to minor delinquency. We don't necessarily need religious beliefs to tell us it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to rape, it's wrong to steal. So where religion might really play a role is in terms of minor offending. On the whole, social bonding has received some empirical support, and that varies from low to moderate support. Some are in the opposite direction from Hirschi's prediction. One thing that Hirschi predicts is that it doesn't matter who your attachments are to, they should still create a tighter social bond. But we do know that association with delinquent peers weakens that bond. Hirschi then also collaborates with Gottfredson on the self-control theory. And during this time, Hirschi's moving away from his social bond theory, and they talk about one type of control. They talk about self-control. This is presented often as what's sometimes referred to as a general theory of crime. And I'm not going to talk about this one in too much depth because Shirai is going to cover this topic for her Pechakucha. So what about, is there a relationship then between self-control theory and social bond theory? So the concept of low self-control is similar to concepts such as vulnerable self-concept and internal control. These are early control theories prior to Hirschi's development of social bonds. This isn't really a separate element in social bond theory, and social bond theory rejects this concept of self-control, says it's unobservable. So they sometimes sort of assume it's accounted for under attachment. But obviously, this is central in Gottfredson and Hirschi's theory. They don't talk about, Gottfredson and Hirschi don't clarify how this theory relates to social bond. So Hirschi basically has two theories, and they diverge on a critical point. The second perspective here, the self-control theory, argues that social bonds have no influence on criminal involvement. And they also say that the relationship between social bonds and crime is spurious. So it's essentially a false relationship. The relationship, when you see it in research, is explained by an underlying factor. And this is something we really want to look for when we are conducting research. If we think variable X explains some outcome, we want to make sure that both X and Y are not explained by some third variable. So how testable is self-control theory? Well, this is one of the places where we see a flaw in this theory. So one of the arguments here is that not only does low self-control explain criminal behavior, but it also explains what the authors refer to as analogous behavior. Smoking, drinking, unplanned pregnancies, that these are also caused by low self-control. One of the problems is, though, that they often use this analogous behavior as a variable in testing for low self-control. So if these analogous behaviors are present, those are indicative of low self-control. But if low self-control explains this, then we start to get into this tautological argument, where we're essentially in a circular argument. control is the cause of criminal behavior, this makes its testability comes to be called into question. As I mentioned, it becomes tautological. So we have to develop separate concepts or measures of self-control. So we can't use the analogous behavior as a measure of self-control, because then what we're saying is self-control causes low self-control. So there's been some research that directly and indirectly tests this. So Keene, Maxim, and Teven studied DUI. They assumed that offenders who reported drinking alcohol during the week prior to the DUI arrest are low in self-control. They then report that drinking alcohol is related to DUI offenses. This becomes tautological. You're basically saying frequency of alcohol behavior is related to another alcohol behavior. It doesn't really tell us anything about self-control. Gottfredson and Hirschi argue that the best indicators of self-control are the acts we use self-control to explain. So as I mentioned, this is where we get into this tautological argument. So Lagrange and Silverman used self-reported smoking and drinking as measures of low self-control, and then they used this as predictors of other forms of delinquency. Since both smoking and drinking are explained by low self-control, this creates a tautological situation. So one thing we could try to do is locate behavior that's neither criminal nor analogous, but still indicates low self-control. People who borrow things and don't return them, people who miss important appointments. When we look at this, though, we don't find that this has a relationship to criminal behavior. So we can't make this argument then that both crime and analogous behavior are caused by low self-control, because we are not able to support this. This is a tautological argument. Other people have used indirect measures of low self-control, persistence or change in individual tendencies towards delinquency, and we've gotten some mixed results here. So low self-control does lead to a greater stable tendency to commit deviance. Most delinquency is adolescent limited, and most antisocial kids do not become antisocial adults. Hay and Forrest found greater stability of self-control from childhood to adolescence, with a very small portion really changing their level of self-control, whereas Berg found substantial instability in self-control across time. Benson and Moore looked at white-collar offenders, and they compared them to common property and drug offenders. Gottfredson and Hirschi contend there should be no difference here. All crime is because of low self-control, so we shouldn't see a lot of specialization amongst offenders, and we should see a variety of criminal behavior. Benson found some white-collar offenders similar to other offenders, but he didn't have records of other offenses to the same extent. Picaro, who is a really prolific author, he teaches at the University of Texas, Dallas, and has written on a variety of things and does some really advanced research, found that there was versatility with a tendency for offense specialization to increase with age. So how versatile you were and the types of offenses you were committing was related to early onset of deviant behavior. But when we control for age, that disappears. So one finding of his does support low self-control, and the other finding does not. Sullivan found considerable short-term offense specialization amongst a group of convicted felons. Again, remember, specialization should be something that doesn't support control theory. Grasmeek did a more direct test with non-tautological cognitive attitude measures. So they tried to tap into different dimensions, different concepts that could explain self-control or that would indicate low self-control. They found mixed support of self-control as a thing that would explain fraud and force. It did account for recidivism, but only for 4% of the variation. Vasogny looked at various measures of self-control clusters together as a single factor of self-control, which is supportive of the theory. Other research has found that it does not hold well as a single factor. That things like risk-taking and impulsivity are better predictors. Cochrane did a study of academic dishonesty, while Sellers looked at interpersonal violence. and Hay looked at ineffective monitoring and punishment of deviant acts, and they found similar findings. So Sellers found that those high in self-control took the perceived rewards of violence into account more than those with low self-control. And Hay found that there was a weak to moderate relationship between parenting and sanctioning of deviant behavior with deviance. When they added things like fairness of discipline and parental acceptance, that relationship became even stronger. In fact, the strength of that relationship doubled. Pratt and Cullen conducted a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when the researchers go back and they look at all the research on a particular topic and reanalyze it together. And they found consistent effects in the expected direction and found that on average, low self-control explains 90% of the variance in crime. So this is an important predictor. While we'd like to be able to point to causes or theories that could explain really large percentages of differences between people and why they offend, 19% is actually pretty strong. When they add in definitions favorable to crime and differential peer association, so essentially when they add in elements of differential association theory, which is a social learning theory, they can explain twice as much of the variance. So this is a theory that is parsimonious and has a wide scope, but what it needs to resolve is this tautology. So we can't define low self-control as behaviors that we also say low self-control predicts. So let's look at Hirschi's social bonding modification of self-control theory. So in 2004, Hirschi proposes a modified version, and he redefines self-control. He says social control and self-control are essentially the same thing. It's essentially our tendency to consider the full range of potential costs of a particular act, and it's the inhibitions we carry. What inhibits us from, deciding to engage in criminal behavior? Do we take into account both short-term and long-term outcomes or consequences? And this focuses more on things like impulsivity, hedonistic attitude. So Bofferson and Hirschi took a lawyerly approach in the past, and they said, yes, the SI theory is tautological, but it should also be tautological. At the same time, no, it's not tautological. So basically, this new definition removes that tautology issue. Data Hirschi uses does not have any direct measures of the new definition. So they are using items originally in the elements and renaming them. And Hirschi is arguing that he is moving closer and closer to a better definition of self-control. But one thing he is doing is moving self-control and social learning to greater compatibility. So sometimes, if you recall, as we change and we amend a theory, it starts to look like another theory, in which case it's no longer the theory we thought we were talking about. So with all theory, a thing we want to think about is, if this is what causes crime, if it is weak bonds to society, if it is low self-control, then how do we address those factors so that we can reduce crime? So policy implications here for social bond theory are pretty similar to social learning theory. So if the problem is we're not sufficiently bonded to society, then what we want to do is institute programs that strengthen that bond between individuals and society. So there's a social development model which tries to do that. They basically want to strengthen attachment and commitment by positively reinforcing that, modeling pro-social attitudes and skills, both in school and in the family. So in first grade, kids were randomly assigned to groups, and as they entered fifth grade, they included everybody in this program. Teachers were trained to use proactive classroom management, interactive teaching, and cooperative learning to strengthen bonds and teach academic and academic and social skills. So they basically would explicitly state their learning objectives, model behaviors. They're teaching kids problem-solving skills as well. Parents were involved on a voluntary basis, but they could be taught very similar skills. How do you better monitor behavior, teach appropriate expectations, and provide consistent consistent discipline. This was an ongoing program, and if you recall, in first grade, they're assigned to two different groups, and what they're doing is they're comparing the group who's receiving the intervention, receiving the program, with a control group, a group that's not receiving the program. At fifth grade, they found that the kids who were in the program were less likely to have initiated alcohol use. They were less likely to be involved in problem behavior. There were greater differences for white boys and smaller differences for African American boys. The intervention group scored higher on commitment and attachment to school. At age 18, the intervention group did better academically and were more attached to school, but at this point they don't differ in terms of minor delinquency, smoking, and drinking. They also don't differ in terms of official arrests and court charges. They do have statistically significant differences in self-reported violence, heavy drinking, sexual activity, and sex with multiple partners. Another project is the Raising Healthy Children project. They also applied that model we just talked about. They identified both risk and protective factors that could be used to address and prevent substance abuse. So 959 students starting in first and second grade, and they're followed through middle school and high school. So some of the benefits of these two programs are that they're following students for a long period of time. One of the things they want to do is increase abstinence and reduce the probability of onset of alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco use. They also want to reduce frequency or prevent escalation of use amongst people who are using. They use social learning and bonding with the teachers, students, and parents. The teachers were trained in developing positive learning, reading, social and problem skills, and with individual students, they made tutoring and study clubs available on a voluntary basis. The idea here was to improve their academics, increase their bond to school, and develop pro-social beliefs. Parents had after-school workshops on child rearing, handling family conflict. This was intended to enhance bonding to school and family while counteracting associations with substance using peers. It did not seem to affect the decision to remain abstinent in those alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco use. But amongst the intervention group, they did find lower uses of alcohol and marijuana in middle school and high school. So in terms of self-control, what are policy implications here? This has not received explicit incorporation into prevention programs whose outcome has been evaluated. Interventions discussed are consistent, however, with what they propose. Self-control is formed through childhood socialization in the family, so if we want to increase or heighten self-control, we would need policies that have a positive impact on childhood socialization in the family.